Welcome everyone to our webinar this evening. It is certainly going to be the highlight of your Wednesday. So I hope you all are ready. You have your snacks, you've taken your bathroom break, you have coffee, and you're just energized for this webinar today. My name is Devanshi. I will be monitoring the chat to collect questions for our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please use the chat to its fullest extent. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. I am personally a huge fan of Lisa, and I'm always looking for an opportunity to gush about her and tell everyone how amazing she is. Lisa is the new Director of Curriculum and Professional Development here at EduSmart. She is known for offering challenging, creative, hands-on science educator workshops. She has over 34 years of experience in science education, with over 25 years of presenting at conference sessions and workshops for science teachers. Before joining EduSmart with us, she worked as a classroom teacher, a department chair, a department chair, online certification teacher, virtual school curriculum designer, independent science consultant, and science curriculum director. I've been lucky to meet Lisa and talk to her in person a handful of times. If you want to meet Lisa, you guys are all in luck. Lisa will be there in person at Cast and Fast and Fast this year. So if you are attending any of those science teacher conferences in Texas and in Florida, you will have the chance to meet the legend in person. So please, if you haven't registered yet, do register. You will be receiving emails soon about what sessions Lisa will be hosting, but you can go to any of their websites and see what Lisa will be talking about. So without further ado, please give your warmest welcome to Lisa.
Thank you, Devanshi. All right, so today we're going to talk about how can we change maybe labs that we're already doing to incorporate elements of inquiry to them. So I'm calling it a recipe for change. And there we go. I'm actually going to start out with a video. So it's pretty short, about 3 minutes, but it's well worth it, and it sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today.
I'm going to give you guys 3 numbers, a 3-number sequence, and I have a rule in mind that these 3 numbers obey. And I want you to try to figure out what that rule is. But the way that you can get information is by proposing your own set of 3 numbers, to which I will say, yes, that follows my rule, or no, it doesn't follow my rule, and then you can propose what you think the rule is. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so here are the 3 numbers. 2, 4, 8.
2, 4, 8.
You don't need to continue the sequence, you can propose a totally different sequence, whatever you want to propose, and I will simply say yes or no, that follows my rule.
2, 4, 8. 16, 32.
16, 32, and
64.
yeah.
Those also follow my rule.
Okay.
What's the rule? What are you thinking?
Multiply by 2.
That is not my rule.
What?
That's not my rule. But you're allowed, if you want, propose 3 other numbers.
3, 6, 12.
3, 6, 12.
3, 6, 12 follows my rule.
10, 20, 40.
10, 20, 40.
That follows the rule.
Yeah, I'm still multiplying by 2.
I know. I know what you're doing. And yes, it follows my rule, but no, it's not my rule.
5, 10,
10 and 20.
Follows my rule.
100,
200, 400.
Follows my rule.
500, 1,000, 2,000.
Follows my rule.
Want me to keep going?
But do I just keep going? You're going to tell me your rule?
Am I doing it the wrong way? Am I approaching this the wrong way?
You're totally fine,
Okay.
but you're approaching it the way most people approach it. Like, think strategically about this. You want information.
Yeah.
I have information. The point of the 3 numbers, right, is to allow you to figure out what the rule is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to give you the numbers that I don't think fits the sequence and then see what you say. So I'll say 2, 4, 7.
Fits my rule.
So whatever I propose is right?
So is your rule like you can propose any number?
So the rule is anything we say is yes.
No.
Damn it.
But you are on the right track
Okay.
now. Hit me with 3 numbers.
3, 6, 9.
Follows my rule.
Oh, that didn't follow my rule.
This is good, right?
5, 10, 15.
That follows my rule.
What? Oh. Really?
Yeah.
I don't believe this.
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
Follows the rule.
What about 7, 8, 9?
Follows. Yes, that follows the rule.
8, 16, 39.
Fits the rule.
Excellent.
But we're no closer to the rule. I want you to get to the rule.
How about 1, 7, 13?
Follows the rule.
What?
11, 12, 13.
How does this
Follows
make
the rule.
sense?
10,
I don't
9,
know how to
8.
do this.
Does not follow the rule.
10, 9, 8 does not.
Oh, so is it all in ascending order?
Booyah.
Okay.
Up top. Yes, first
that
ones
what
to
it
get
is?
it. You guys nailed it. That's the rule. That's
always-
the rule. Increase numbers in increasing order.
Aw.
Numbers in ascending order.
Oh, so much.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 15, 25. Doesn't matter. Any numbers in ascending order. I was inspired to make this video by the book The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. Now, the black swan is a metaphor for the unknown and the unexpected. I mean, in the old world, the theory was that all swans were white. So each instance of a white swan would make you think, yeah, that theory's pretty good. But the point is, you can never prove a theory true. And in fact, when people found Australia, they realized that there were black swans. What was interesting for me was that everyone I spoke to came up with a rule very early on and then only proposed numbers that fit with that rule they were thinking. I was looking for you guys to propose a set of numbers that didn't follow your rule
Right.
and didn't follow my rule. I was looking for you guys not to try to confirm what you believe. You're always asking something where you expect the answer to be yes, right? Like you're trying to get at it.
Yeah.
But instead you want to get the
Like
no.
impossible.
You want to get the no because that's much more informational for you than the yes. Like if everything's
No, that
giving a
is
yes.
true. That is really true once you say that.
That is what's so important about the scientific method. We set out to disprove our theories. And it's when we can't disprove them that we say, this must be getting at something really true about our reality. So I think we should do that in all aspects of our lives. If you think that something is true, you should try as hard as you can to disprove it. Only then can you really get at the truth and not fool yourself.
So, love that video, because if you stop and think about what you're doing in your classroom, a lot of times the labs you're doing are verifying some kind of knowledge that you want your students to understand. And science is not about verification. So they're not doing inquiry if they're doing a verification lab. Ideally, a lab activity, they should have no idea what the answer is. And they're going to have to gather data and analyze the data and try to figure out a pattern or find the rule so that they can figure out what's going on. So inquiry works very different than a typical cookbook lab. So what I'm calling a cookbook lab is typically a lab that's like a worksheet format where the kids are given the purpose. Maybe they have to fill out the hypothesis, but they're given step-by-step directions on what to do to gather the data. And there's minimal thinking that goes on. I would imagine that you probably had students like I did who just went and grabbed materials before they even understood what the lab was about. That can't work if you're doing inquiry, that you're trying to have the kids focus on discovering something new or finding some new relationship. And a cookbook lab also really doesn't teach them anything about the nature of the scientific process. Just because you're following a procedure and you're leading them to gathering data and analyzing data doesn't mean they understand what they're doing. They don't really understand experimental design because it's been designed for them. And in an inquiry lab, that understanding of experimental design and the scientific process is the key to doing the whole thing, that's just as important as the content. Cookbook labs don't allow kids to deal with uncertainty. I'm sure you've had labs where kids came up with data and you're like, this doesn't even make any sense. How do you not know that this doesn't make sense? How do you not know that this is bad data? It's because they don't understand the premise of the lab. But mainly they need to be able to have that procedural knowledge of how do I find the answer to my question. But the main reason that you need to think about moving labs from a cookbook version to an inquiry version is the degree of rigor that's involved. Cookbook labs are very low rigor. It's a verification lab. It's just a fill in the blank as they go, follow the directions, where an inquiry lab is very, very different. So when students are doing inquiry, eventually you want them to be asking the questions, but sometimes you have to start with a guided inquiry where you help them ask a question. You make sure they give priority to the evidence that they generate. They are able to formulate and compare different explanations, and they can communicate and justify those explanations. That's what you're doing when you're doing inquiry. And you as a teacher are promoting that when you ask productive questions that give them opportunities to do these things, that you challenge them to look for patterns in the data, that you guide them as they develop those explanations, and you create situations where the kids can do science talk, that they can talk to each other and they have to be able to justify their explanation based on the data and the evidence that they generated with the lab activity. So for those of you that are customers of EduSmart, this is the whole design behind our instructional modules. That this is why we have those built-in pauses that show up at the bottom of the screen. This is why the video stops and why you can't just push play and walk away. Is because we ask questions that try to get them to think about the content and what could they do in order to get to some kind of answer. Like this was a 5th grade lesson on separating mixtures. We also have activities, student activities that you can, these are the printable, downloadable ones. This is also a 5th grade activity that it's already designed to do inquiry. So this is organisms' interactions with their ecosystem and investigation. Note that this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is not a procedure. These are telling them what they needed to make sure they do when they do this observational investigation. And the focus is on evaluating and analyzing the data, not on generating the data and answering some predetermined analysis questions. We also have inquiry built into our interactive simulations. This is one in a middle school, I forget which grade level, about earth structures on volcanoes. And so this starts out with making sure they understand concepts that they're going to need in order to finish the simulation and understand the content. But their questions are built in and the students have to choose which one do you think will have the fastest flow rate. And then after they gather data, they have to analyze the data. And then this one has even more data analysis where they're asked to rank them, which is data analysis. And then finally, we connect it back to, or for the first time, connect it to lava. And this is an example of another important thing that's you should be doing, which is sometimes doing the activity before the content. I think another term is explore before explain. And for those of you in Texas that are coming to CAST, this is what one of my sessions is going to be on. We're going to do a hands-on, very messy activity before content investigation. So back to talking about rigor and doing inquiry versus cookbook. I love this quote. I've had it so long, I don't remember where I got it from, but learning happens when it's the students, not the teacher, doing the work. So I always tell teachers, if you're working harder than your students are, then you need to kind of switch this up, that they should be doing more thinking than you are. And really the biggest barrier to you already doing this is time. That you do the cookbook lab because you only have 20 or 25 minutes and you've got to get everything done in that time span. But realize what you're giving up when you do that. That the first time you try to do a lab where you give them more ownership and expect them to do experimental design, it takes so much longer than you think it will because they don't like to think. So you have to encourage them and prod them and keep them on task. But if you continue to do it, they spend less time fighting, doing the thinking, and actually just getting down to business because you tell them, hey, you've only got 15 minutes to gather your data today, so better get moving. So for those of you who are not familiar with levels of inquiry, this is not anything new, but this is showing you how inquiry can be in graduated steps. And what we call limited inquiry is at the bottom of this pyramid. This is a typical traditional cookbook lab. Students follow the directions. They make sure their data matches what the teacher expects. a lot of times these are a verification lab done after the teachers cover the content, so they may already even know the answer. That's why we call it limited. In structured inquiry, there's no predetermined answer. Conclusions are based solely on the investigation that the kids have done, that they don't know what to expect. And in guided inquiry, there's no predetermined method, that you don't give them a procedure. The students have to figure out the best way to investigate the problem. And as you might imagine, this one takes even longer than doing structured inquiry because, again, they have to think. And then at the very top is open inquiry. Here, there's no question. The students have to propose and pursue their own questions. This is what science fair is supposed to be. So open inquiry takes so long that you cannot possibly do this in your class, that this is an independent outside of class that you could help guide the student, but you don't have time to do this as a regular lab. Open inquiry takes an incredible amount of time. So when someone does a science fair project where they copy something off the internet, that is not what it's supposed to be. That they're supposed to be coming up with their own question, figuring out how to answer it, analyzing the data, coming to a conclusion, all on their own. So I don't know if you've ever had training on Webb's depth of knowledge. This is a way that we can quantify the level of rigor in something. And coincidentally, it also has 4 levels, where level 1 is recall and reproduction, similar to the limited inquiry on our pyramid. Whoops, I went backwards, sorry. Level 2 in assessing rigor is applying skills and concepts. Level 3 is using strategic thinking and reasoning. And level 4 is extended thinking. This is where a student has to connect something from what they're learning in science today to something they've already learned, or to some other kind of science, or to something else entirely like art or music, that they're able to make these connections. So just to make sure we understand that what DOK or depth of knowledge is, I just have a question, and you can just say yes or no in the chat, or put your hand up if you think that these 2 math questions are the same depth of knowledge. I should have put a quick poll in here, but it's too late now. Do I have a volunteer who wants to? Devanshi, is anyone saying anything in the chat?
Let's see. So far, no.
No.
Do you mind reiterating your question, Lisa?
Yeah, are these 2 math problems the same depth of knowledge? Like if we're trying to assess.
We have a no.
A no, okay.
We have a yes.
We have a yes.
A yes.
Okay, I won't belabor this, but these
no.
are the
yes,
are,
no.
Okay,
we've got it all over the place. About half and half.
These are exactly the same depth of knowledge. Because if you look at the cognitive task you're asking a student to do, you're asking them to add numbers and carry something over to the next column over in the place value. Pardon?
There is no other column in that first one, so I don't know how the carry would work for the 9 to 4. I mean 9 plus 4.
I don't know how to teach math, but you do when you do. Oh, I see what you're saying.
There's
but they
only
still
one
have
place
to
value.
right. You have to understand that there's a new place value when you add some numbers together. So the question on the right, or the problem on the right, is more difficult because they have to do it multiple times, but the cognitive task you're asking them to do is the same. So rigor is not about the level of difficulty. Something can be rigorous just because of the cognitive task. It doesn't mean it has to be difficult. So don't think that my kids can't do higher level thinking. They may not be able to do higher level thinking at a difficult level, but they can do it. You have to scaffold it, and I'm going to give you suggestions on how you can do that. So I don't know about my Florida teachers, but here in Texas, the last time our standards changed, the sort of saying was pay attention to the verb that's in the standard. And that will tell you what level you need to teach it to. And I'm going to tell you that that is entirely incorrect. that if you want to know what level the DOK is, you have to pay attention to the cognitive task you're asking the student to do. So I'm going to come up with four statements, level 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they're all going to start with describe, showing you that it is not all about the verb. And so I just picked rocks for this example. So a level 1 task might be describe 3 characteristics of metamorphic rock. This just requires simple recall and be able to turn around and tell me what those are. A level 2, describe differences between metamorphic and igneous rock. So now I'm going to have to do some compare and contrast. That's a higher cognitive skill than just remember. Level 3, describe a model you might use to represent the relationships that exist within the rock cycle. Now I have to figure out, how do I represent this as a model? That's a lot harder than comparing and contrasting. And then for an example of a level 4, describe how the rock cycle is similar to the water cycle, include a description of forces involved. So now I'm going to have to connect this to something that's not even our topic of the day. And this is not, they're not going to be able to come up with this by the end of the class period, because they're going to have to really think and maybe go read about forces and go back and read some more about the water cycle in order to answer those questions. So why is it important to pay attention to the DOK, or the rigor of what you ask kids to do? Why is it important? Well, it boils down to, you have to pay attention to this because students at several grade levels, I'm not exactly sure where we test in Florida, but in Texas, we test at grade 5, grade 8 in biology. I think it's the same in Florida, but I'm just not sure. That for Florida, they tell you in advance what the DOK level is going to be for the questions. And so they do it by percentage of points, where low is like level 1, moderate is level 2, high is more level 2 to 3 to 3. And every year they have the same range of percentages of questions from low to moderate to high. And it's very easy to see that the majority of the questions are at that level 2. And so if you teach at a level 1, you just ask kids to remember facts and tell you, or to verify what they already know, they're not going to have the practice and cognitive processing to be able to answer a lot of level 2 questions. I have a lot more data in Texas, since that's where I've worked for the last 34 years. We don't have a rubric to tell us how many what the DOK level is going to be for any of our questions, even not only before, but not even after the test. So I have personally gone through all of these tests and assessed the DOK level of the question. And again, it's easy to see where are the majority of the questions in terms of DOK, and they're at level 2. So that's true for 5th grade. Here are the numbers for 8th grade. We didn't give a test in 2020, so that's why that line is missing. Again, majority of the questions were at a level 2. Those of you in Texas, if you're an 8th grade teacher, you might be surprised that the test was actually less rigorous last spring than usual. Our statewide scores did not reflect that, but that is true. And then here in biology, we actually had the same breakdown as last year. But again, most of the questions are at a level 2. So you can't just ask questions at a level 1, and you can't just do labs at a level 1, or they're not going to be able to analyze data that they have to on these statewide tests. So how can you use this information in your classroom, just about rigor in general? Pay attention to the questions that you're asking. If you're asking them a factual question where the answer is yes or no, or a word, try to bump it up and ask questions that are more analytical, or even better, that are hypothetical or reflective questions where they have to stop and think. You may not always have time for those affective questions that ask them to apply to a novel situation. Sometimes that shows up in the classroom. Like, I've had kids ask a question and I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's a good question. And we have to stop everything we're doing and we're going to figure out how we're going to answer that question. I was in the classroom a very long time, and that happened twice in all of those years. So it's not something, most kids are not good at those affective questions. So the good news, again, for those of you who are EdgeSmart customers, is that those reflective questions show up in our materials all the time. So this is an instructional module in middle school on photosynthesis where we're covering content, but built into this as we go are some of those reflective questions. How do you think the ingredients for photosynthesis get into the leaf? That's not part of the standard, but it makes them stop and think, oh, you know, maybe I didn't think about that. How do they get in there? And they're going to understand the process better after at least thinking about answers to these more reflective questions. And of course, they're built into our activities and simulations as well. You'll see that there'll be a question, why is this? Why is it easy to observe photosynthesis underwater? And again, make sure they understand the design process. Why does each aquarium need a bubbler? Why do we need to bubble air in there? So that they understand what they're doing. And then they have hypotheses they can pick from. And then once they gather data, it's time to formulate a conclusion. So we want them to do that data analysis, look at that information. All of the simulations that we have in EdgeSmart also have a printable claim evidence reasoning worksheet for the kids to go through. This is that deeper analysis. So this is available for any of our simulations. And this is something you can do, even if you only have time to do a cookbook lab, you can still make them try to apply a little bit of deeper analysis by having them do a CER frame once you're done. I found an inquiry analysis tool online. I have the link up there, but Devanshi's going to put it in the chat. And I'm also going to give you a copy of the slide deck, so don't feel like you have to write this down. But if you're thinking, okay, I have this lab and I really want to do it, is how much inquiry is in there? You can take that tried and true favorite lab and go through this rubric and see how many yeses you get versus no. And if you don't get very many yeses, I'm going to also show you how you can scaffold that cookbook lab and maybe add a little bit more inquiry to it. Because ideally you want this tool to have a lot of things in the yes column. And then it had more than I could fit on one slide. Are they asked to revise their explanation? Do they have opportunities to discuss their idea in small groups? That these are all very important, that communication part of doing scientific inquiry. So there are things you can do to sort of transform the recipe. Take that cookbook lab and turn it into inquiry. You can take the purpose statement and turn it into a question that students have to answer, rather than telling them what the purpose of the lab is. Make it a question that they're going to be curious, hopefully, about figuring out what it's supposed to do. Involve them in activities where they have to generate the questions to investigate. For those teachers who are here from Florida, this is what I'm going to talk about at FAST. I think I'm on deck next Friday morning to talk about using driving question boards. So that's an incredibly important part of it. Make sure that they have a good question and that they can learn to tweak those questions into questions that can be turned into an experimental investigation. And then the question needs to be relevant to the students. You kind of need to know in your mind what kind of question you're sort of leading them to, because you know what lab activity you want them to do. Even if you don't tell them the procedure or anything, you already have in mind, because you have to have materials gathered for it. And we'll talk about more about how you do that, like I said, in my FAST presentation. And if you're interested, we can do the driving question board as a webinar later on in the year. So this is probably the easiest thing to do, is take your recipe and then just don't give them all of it. After third grade in both Texas and Florida, students are expected to know how to make their own data table. Do you really need to give them the data table where they just fill in the boxes? Maybe not. I don't know if you've ever asked your students to create their own data table. It doesn't matter what grade level you teach. They don't like to do it. And why don't they like to do it? Because they have to think. And and I just remember the first time I tried to do an inquiry lab with some high school chemistry students, they're like, well, where's our data table? And I'm like, you're in high school. You should know how to make a data table. Work with your group, and if everyone has trouble, then I'll scaffold it and we'll work through it together. But you're not leaving my class without knowing how to make a data table to gather your data from this experiment. So this is about when do you do the lab. Move your explanation, and if you have them read in a textbook, or in other words, learn about the content, maybe move that after the lab instead of before. And if you are doing it after, don't do a verification lab. Make them extend their thinking from what you've done. Expect all students to be able to develop an explanation based on evidence that they collected. And so just answering an analysis question doesn't mean that they're developing an idea for how to connect the data they collected to an explanation of what has happened. You have to give them an opportunity to work and talk together, not just about who's going to go get the balance and who's going to write something down in terms of the lab work, but for the data analysis part. And engage them in that data analysis, but help them look for patterns. This doing a evidence-based explanation like a CER frame, you know, you can't just throw that to them and expect them to know what to do. That takes some scaffolding on your part as well. Provide opportunities for them to present their explanation to other audiences. My favorite inquiry labs are one where you just give kids a question to answer, and you give them the materials, but you don't tell them what to do. And so what that means is that each lab group or each small group may not be doing the exact same experiment. And so in that case, you have to bring them back together and let them discuss and talk about what they're doing with their peers, because they're not going to be able to compare apples to apples when it comes to the data that they collected. It depends on their procedure and what kind of data they decided to collect. And then evaluate the logic of their explanations and their peers' explanations by doing class discussions, or have them do a whiteboard and do a stay and stray where one person stays and they have to go look at what other lab groups did. Lots of ways to do that. So I have some practice for you. So what I'm going to have you do is look at a typical cookbook lab. This is just the first part of page 1. I took a screenshot. I put a link to the lab if you want to see the whole thing. I think Devanchi's going to put it in the chat. But I want you to brainstorm in the chat ways that you could make this lab have more elements of inquiry in it. What could you do? Anyone have anything in the chat yet, Devanchi? I know you need to read a little bit of it first.
Everyone's been sent the link to the lab to see it a bit better. I think they're all looking at it. Everyone's videos are suddenly, everyone's eyes are squinting. So everyone's reading.
So while we're waiting, if someone wants to turn their mic on and just talk, Devanchi's gonna keep an eye on the chat as well.
We have a few responses now.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
Debbie Van, have them remove the data table. They can create one.
Excellent, excellent. And how much work does that take you to do? All you need is a pair of scissors before you go to the copy machine if you're going to print this out, or, you know, do the cut and paste and just delete it. So no extra work for you not to give them a data table.
We have another idea from Rebecca. Leave the sample choices open-ended.
Oh, okay. Another good choice. Make sure you have them in your room so that they're not asking for something you don't have. But yes, I agree.
Another idea, provide the materials only.
Yes. Also good.
Get rid of the steps.
Get rid of the steps. Okay. Okay, for this, sometimes you can't always get rid of the steps. I'll show you how you can scaffold that too. If they don't know how to use the spring scale, you can't just assume they're going to know what to do if you set them out on the table. So this depends on, you know, where the lab is in the year and what they've already done, but absolutely, you do not always have to give them a procedure. One big thing that no one has come up with is there's no question. This should be trying to answer a question. So somehow on the top, you need to turn what is on there into a question. And if you don't want to do the work, if you just want to hand the kids a cookbook lab, make them turn it into a question. Like I said, shouldn't always be the burden on you to be doing all the thinking. All really good ideas. And you have to remember that you're going to need to connect it back to, if you do this before you talk about friction, or even if you do it after you talk about friction, you're going to need to connect it to their everyday world if you can. And so I have examples of some YouTube videos, one of which is extremely long, so you would not want to show the whole thing. And one which is a little shorter, but it was kind of interesting. What would happen if we didn't have any friction? What would happen to the world? And that one's much more manageable at only 4 minutes. So I have one more example of a typical cookbook lab. And so again, in the chat, what is something you could do to make this lab an inquiry lab? And you're going to notice that your suggestions may sound a lot the same as the first one. So again, I'm not asking you to reinvent the wheel to do this. That we can do a lot of those same things. Take away the data table. This one has one question up in the beginning. But you can do similar things. I don't know if someone's saying something different in the chat, Devanshi, but they're still trying to get to the...
Everyone's eyes are squinting, so I think everyone's still reading.
Okay, okay. I don't want to stay too long on this because I want time for question and answer, but what is not shown, and these example labs I gave are usually what follows the data table are those analysis questions. Definitely do not give them any of those. Let them figure out what the data is supposed to say. Don't tell them what to look for. Those analysis questions are great questions to keep them. Those are good for you because when you come back and see them the next class period, you're going to want to assess what did they get out of this lab? What do they remember? What do they understand? And you have those built-in questions right there that you can answer them. So those are valuable. So don't give it to the kids. Save those for you. And use those to make sure that they knew what they were doing. And if you take the cookbook aspect out of here and they have to do more thinking, they're going to remember more about the lab when you come back and try to do a recap over what you covered. I can promise you those. I will tell you that it is, again, that it is painful in terms of how much time this takes when you do it for the first time, because your students want you just give it to me. Just give me the data table, because it'll be so much faster and I don't have to think. But just stick with it and realize that in the end, your kids are going to be doing a lot more cognitive processing to get to an understanding of what's going on. Anything new in the chat? Okay, so I'm going to move on with some ways that you can take a simple lab you do about solubility and make sure they understand in the real world why is solubility important. So it helps them understand hot springs and mineral waters. I always like to talk about mineral water, and I usually get on my soapbox about that high pH water that you can buy at the grocery store and how it supposedly has all these health benefits. The minerals in it, yes. The high pH, not really, because your stomach acid is at such a low pH. It doesn't matter what you put in it. Everything's going to go to a pH 2 once it reaches your stomach anyway. And then also a problem of ocean acidification, which is because of something that has been put in the ocean, which is not supposed to be there, and it's changing the pH of the ocean. So other ways to modify the level of inquiry. This is one of my favorite tips. So this is just a simple lab where they have to learn how to use a microscope. What drove me crazy as a classroom teacher, I taught 5th grade all the way through seniors, is that those kids would read the material list and just go grab everything. And they didn't even know what they were doing. And if you're doing a lab on how to use a microscope, you can't have them come up with a procedure because they don't know how to use a microscope. So what I started doing with some of these earlier labs in the year as a scaffolding is I would take the steps of the procedure, I would cut them into strips, and I would put the strips in a Ziploc bag and say, your lab group has to put these in the correct sequence before you're allowed to go get your materials. Because it made them read every step of the material, all of it, and to have to order this and, you know, the correct chronological order required a whole lot more cognitive processing than reading. And so by the time they put these in order, they knew what they were supposed to do. And it also stopped the questions like, Miss, what am I supposed to do next? Because you had to do this before you were allowed to go get your materials. So it cut out the problem of everybody running to get something so they could grab it first and take it back to their table. And it works even if it's a procedure where you need to make sure they understand the procedural steps. Let's say you're doing a lab with a Bunsen burner. You don't want them to come up with their own procedure. You want to make sure that everyone follows the same procedure if it has to do with using equipment or something that's safety. But this is, you could do this with any lab. If you want to bump up the cognitive processing, maybe not for this one since it's sort of a new task, is do a cookbook lab, do this with the procedural steps, leave one out, and they have to tell you which one's missing. They really don't like that because they have to think. So these are great ways to scaffold getting to having them do the procedure on their own. Identifying independent, dependent variables, identifying controls that sort of start with this kind of scaffold before you let them loose to do it on their own. And here's a typical cookbook lab that has everything in there: the background, the purpose, the materials, safety, procedure, data table, and the analysis questions. And I already know you know exactly what to do to modify this one. And that is, don't give them everything. This one's really easy because it's a 2-page lab. All you have to do is give them page 1. Very little effort on your part to modify this lab for them. Hang on to the questions, and then, like I said, you can ask the next day. Because this one's using Bunsen burner, I wouldn't have them come up with their own procedure. Sometimes procedures are important, so leave that in there for a lab like this. So you don't have to throw out your favorite cookbook lab, but you can modify it. Just realize that even these small modifications mean it's going to take them longer to do things like data analysis, or even you're going to probably not be happy the first time at how long it takes them to make a data table. But in the end, you have kids who truly understand the process of science and the nature of science. So I'm going to open this up to questions, reminding you that you're going to get a copy of the slide deck, a link to the recording, instructions for obtaining CPE credit, and Devanshi will send that out early next week. I also wanted to make sure you knew how to contact me. If you have a question, you're like, oh, I wanted to ask a question, but I didn't think of it till later. Go ahead and just shoot me an email. My email is very easy. I'm just lisa@edgesmart.com. So I'm gonna open up the floor here.
So while everyone is coming up with questions, Lisa, I know you were focused on your presentation, but the chat was incredibly lively.
Okay, yay.
We had Terry at the very beginning started us off with a wonderful quote by Albert Einstein, saying, if we knew what it was we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it?
Excellent. I like that.
But we had a lot of affirmations from Alvarado, Debbie, Catherine, Rebecca, with answering to your questions, wanting to know where cast and fast was.
Okay.
We have one question. I would love to know how to get the littles to start doing these labs? What is a good place to start if this is something that they need to end up doing? From Catherine.
Right, that's a very good question. It is a little bit harder to do with littles because you're usually only doing an observational kind of lab, but you can do the guiding questions like, what do we need to pay attention to? What are some things we can put in a data table? The little ones, especially K and 1, you're going to have to make the table for them. There's no way that they're going to be able to understand how to do that. But you can do it as a group, and you can come to a group consensus about, should we put this on there? Should we not put it on there? But you mainly focus on asking them leading questions just so that they can get the analysis that you want, or they pay attention to the observations that you want them to pay attention to. But absolutely, inquiry is not just for upper grades, not at all. That's a very good question.
And Catherine, thanks for being our chat rock star this evening. We've got some great chat bits there. Catherine at one point messaged things I learned today. Just
oh, wonderful.
So yes.
So
we have another question from Victoria that's just come in. If we put the lab before the reading and research, should we do a follow-up lab after as well?
Okay, there is no such thing as too much lab. There is no such thing. They should definitely be doing more lab than you are doing talking. Now you have to do some work to set it up so that their lab is connected to the content. But if you follow the 5E model, and you certainly don't have to, there are other models, then you should do a lab before the content, and you should do another lab after the content. But when I was in the classroom, we did lab. I only had them every other day, and so we did lab at least 2 of those days. So sometimes it was every day. We would do something, even if it was short. And they come in like, what are we doing today? Rather than sitting down and putting their head down on the table. That they knew, even though they were going to have to think, that they were going to do something where they learned something or they had a question answered. So.
Victoria responded, love that answer.
Yeah, no such thing.
We have some ideas being shared by Terry. Really reinforce the good answers for little ones to encourage more attempts to answer and get that pat on the back reward.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially working with little ones. The first, in my previous job, I was a curriculum coordinator, and the first time I went to visit a kindergarten class, the kids had a little worksheet. They were like rolling cars down a ramp. They had no idea why, but they were rolling the cars down the ramp. At the end, they had to make a hypothesis at the beginning, and at the end, they had to circle a statement. My hypothesis was right with a smiley face, and my hypothesis was wrong with a frowny face. And I was just like, oh no. I mean, I understand that every kindergarten teacher doesn't have a background in science, but there's no value to a hypothesis. And there's no such thing as sort of like a bad question or a bad answer. It's just some of them you need to continue to query and ask more questions until they get to the knowledge that you want them to have. But there's no such thing as a wrong answer. We can have data that doesn't fit in with our rule, but sometimes it's not always, bad observation or bad reading on something. Sometimes something happens that you don't expect. That happens in real science all the time, and that's when we learn something new.
I love that. We have one, Jerry, right in EduSmart has activities for K2 located
Yes.
in teacher resources and expository.
Absolutely. And we also have interactivities for kids. It doesn't have, a lab can be virtual. Our simulations, are not wet labs where the kids are gathering materials and doing things, but that built-in questioning is in there at all grade levels. We have that built-in questioning. That you just get them to think that that's the idea behind doing inquiry. So I'm going to move to the last slide, which is we have a plethora of people who can help answer questions about EduSmart. I'm the newest kid on the block. I've only been there since February, but some of these fabulous people have been there for over a decade. And if there's something I don't know about the product, because I haven't seen every lesson at every grade level, one of these wonderful people is certainly going to be able to help answer those questions.
That puts us at time, Lisa. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I know a lot of you had more questions or had comments or wanted to talk to Lisa. As Lisa said, we are all here to support all of you teachers. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so, so much. Again, you will be receiving an email from me early next week, but until then, thank you all you educators for all the wonderful work you are doing. And we will see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for
And
coming.
thank you so much, Lisa.
Yeah.
Round of applause for Lisa. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. I learned a lot, and this was my second time listening to it, and I was like, what? So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that wraps it up for us. Have a nice one, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.